The tension in the studio was palpable before Arnold Schwarzenegger even walked onto the set, but no one would say it aloud, not the producers pacing backstage with earpieces pressed to their temples, not the interns fidgeting behind. The audience seating, and certainly not the co-hosts of The View, whose morning energy felt thinner than usual, as if they already sensed they'd summoned a storm they couldn't control. The live audience was giddy with anticipation, lulled into applause as the doors opened and Schwarzenegger, a towering presence of politics, cinema, and unapologetic bluntness, strode in with that unmistakable mix of charm and gravitas. His smile was polite but restrained, and when he shook hands across the table, Whoopi, Sonny, Sarah, it was cordial, rehearsed, but his glance stopped on Joy Behar for a second too long, and in that brief pause was 1,000 unsaid things. Joy, sensing it, leaned forward with that signature smirk and a stack of notes she didn't plan to let go to waste. "So, Arnold," she began with a lilt too sweet to be sincere, "you've had quite the journey, from bodybuilder to governor to climate crusader? That's quite the transformation." The audience chuckled, sensing the dig, and Arnold's smile didn't flinch, but the light in his eyes dimmed a degree. "Yes, Joy," he said slowly, accent curling each word with cold precision. "Transformation is what people do when they grow. I've always believed in change, but change with integrity." That landed like a warning shot, but Joy, unfazed, dove in harder. She questioned his past policies as governor of California, pulled quotes out of context, threw jabs about his personal life, an old, lazy tactic dressed as journalism. Arnold took it at first with the stoicism of a man used to public brawls, but something cracked when she interrupted his answer about environmental policy with a flippant remark about his hero complex. The audience grew quieter. The air shifted. Arnold leaned forward, jaw set, voice lower now, the sound of a storm gathering momentum. "Let me tell you something, Joy. You sit here every morning and laugh at people trying to fix the world. You throw stones from a chair padded by a network that survives off outrage and controversy. I've made mistakes. I own them. But at least, I don't profit off pretending I'm better than everyone else." The silence was deafening. Joy's face twitched with a hint of something. Anger, maybe fear, maybe just ego bruised in front of cameras. Whoopi interjected gently, trying to calm things, but Arnold was past diplomacy. "You know what the problem is? You don't want conversation. You want spectacle. And I'm not your spectacle." With that, he stood, his mic crackling as he ripped it off, the audience gasping as the camera scrambled to follow his exit. Security moved instinctively, not to stop him, but to part the way as he stormed off stage, leaving behind a live audience in stunned silence and 4 co-hosts who suddenly looked very, very small behind the glossy table. By the time they cut to commercial, the clip had already been posted online. 30 seconds later, it had gone viral. And just like that, Arnold Schwarzenegger wasn't just a guest who walked off The View. He became the conversation they couldn't control. By the time the sun dipped beneath the Manhattan skyline that evening, Arnold Schwarzenegger's walk-off had already been spliced, subtitled, and spun across every media platform imaginable. And while the talking heads on rival networks debated whether he'd gone too far or not far enough, inside the sleek minimalist offices of a PR agency off Wilshire Boulevard, Arnold sat in silence, his massive frame taking up more space than the leather chair beneath him as a crisis manager. Scrolled nervously through real-time analytics. "You're trending at number 2 worldwide," she said, not looking up. "Only beat by a royal divorce." Arnold didn't respond. His mind wasn't on numbers. It was on the aftermath. The emails from former colleagues, some congratulating, some distancing. The calls he'd ignored. The script he was supposed to be filming next week. The executive who'd texted, "Maybe lay low for a bit." But Arnold was done laying low. Because what he said wasn't a slip, it was deliberate, years in the making. He'd smiled through enough sanitized interviews, nodded through enough passive-aggressive barbs, and danced through enough fake civility to know when enough was enough. And when Joy Behar had turned her chair into a pulpit of snide superiority, she hadn't just poked the bear, she'd awakened a man who had nothing left to lose in that arena. And yet the fallout was as strategic as it was personal. Within 24 hours, producers at ABC scrambled to control the damage, offering statements to the press and privately apologizing for what they called a mismatch of expectations. Joy, for her part, doubled down on her stance, calling Arnold's outburst unprofessional on a podcast that same night, but behind closed doors she was livid, not because he'd walked off, but because the narrative wasn't hers to control anymore. Meanwhile, Arnold took the opposite route. Quiet, composed, and calculated. He released no statement, gave no follow-up interviews. He simply posted a single photo on Instagram, a quote scrawled across a whiteboard in his home gym that read, "Say less. Prove more." The post exploded. Within days, he received an invitation to deliver a keynote at a youth climate summit in Berlin. Hollywood insiders whispered that a streaming giant had approached him to host a new unscripted series on leadership under pressure. The man who'd been mocked for decades as a caricature of muscles and movie quotes was suddenly being recast as a voice of conviction in a time of noise. But inside, Arnold knew this wasn't a comeback story. It was an evolution. And if Joy thought his silence was surrender, she hadn't paid attention to how revolutions begin, not with a bang, but with a man refusing to play by the script. Because while the world debated the decorum of his exit, Arnold was already planning his return, and this time it wouldn't be from a studio chair but a platform they couldn't mute. Weeks passed, but the ripple from that day on The View didn't fade. It widened. Arnold's image transformed from Hollywood icon to cultural lightning rod, and while the network issued careful press releases framing the incident as a misunderstanding, public sentiment leaned hard in his favor. He became a symbol of raw honesty in an industry defined by polished fakery, and that resonance, unexpected, powerful, was something Arnold couldn't ignore. When the Berlin keynote arrived, the room was electric. Young people packed the venue, some wearing vintage Terminator shirts, others holding climate policy proposals, all of them waiting for a man they now saw as more than an actor or ex-governor. He was proof that strength could speak softly and still thunder. Arnold's speech wasn't flashy, but it was real. He spoke of mistakes, responsibility, action over rhetoric. He never once mentioned Joy Behar, but the entire room knew that was the ghost in the narrative. His final words, "We don't need more critics, we need more builders," echoed through headlines the next morning. Meanwhile, back in New York, Joy watched the coverage from her dressing room, the glow of her phone lighting her frown as social. Media celebrated the man who had walked away from her like a failed audition. The network, sensing blood in the water, scheduled a surprise panel to repair her image. Big names, scripted moments. But the magic didn't return. Audiences had seen too much. They'd seen truth walk off their screen and never look back. And so when the call came from a late-night host asking Arnold to do a segment about leadership and public accountability, he didn't hesitate. This time, he walked into the studio not as a guest needing approval, but as a force that had rewritten the rules. Cameras rolled. The host asked the obvious question, "Would you ever go back to The View?" Arnold paused, gave that knowing smile, and said, "Why revisit a rerun when you've moved on to a better script?" The audience roared. It wasn't just a clapback. It was closure. And in that moment, it became clear. Arnold hadn't just stormed off a set. He'd stepped into a legacy that no scripted panel could erase.